Let's bring in Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, who is a defense and security analyst. He previously headed a strategic combat review for the Royal Air Force. He joins me now from London. Sean, good to have you on the show. I'd like to start off by asking your assessment on how you think the conflict has changed in the past 6 months, or perhaps, what the most probable course was and where we are today.
Yes, I mean, that's a simple question. It's a challenging response. I mean, I think, as your analysts have said, there were 3 phases to this. I think Putin expected to just walk into Ukraine initially. That proved to be folly. He then tried to fight his way into Kiev. That didn't work. So now a much more concerted, focused effort in the Donbass. I think despite some heroic Ukrainian defense, gradually the Russians have been prevailing in the Donbass. And it was very difficult to see up until a month ago how Ukraine would be able to change the tide of the war. I think what's been fascinating, particularly over the last 2 weeks, is that we've seen President Zelensky start to take the initiative. And they're shifting the focus down to Kherson, down in the southwest, blowing the bridges on the Dnipro River, targeting the reinforcements out of Crimea. We're starting to see President Zelensky in Ukraine start to take the initiative. And that's had the really interesting effect of Russia moving its troops down from up in the Donbass down to the southwest. In other words, no longer driving the agenda. Now, it's a long way away from being any form of victory. But I do think that, the Western patience, waiting for our Western weapons to get in, it's one thing to commit them. It's quite another for them to actually arrive in the country with trained personnel ready to use them. But we are now starting to see the impact that highly capable, long-range, precision strike Western weapons can have on the tide of this war. But I think, as your commentator said, this is a long game now. This is not going to be resolved anytime soon.
It could be a long game, but do you think that the mood could be changing? Because one of the common phrases used to describe this conflict is that it has become a war of attrition. You mentioned what's been happening in the last 2 weeks. I'd like to add to that the killing of Alexander Dugin's daughter. Do you think this will change and escalate the war?
Well, I can't comment on the loss of the daughter. I mean, clearly that's not really a military impact, and there's a lot of conjecture about exactly how that happened. I do think, though, if you look at from a grand strategic perspective, a military perspective, Russia has committed a lot of resources into this campaign and has lost tens of thousands of its soldiers. It's lost massive amounts of equipment. And by all accounts, it is grinding to a little bit of a halt. Now, that doesn't preclude further action, but there's a weather window as well. In the next 8 to 10 weeks, once the rains arrive and the autumn and the winter arrives, off-road maneuver warfare is going to be a lot more difficult to conduct. And therefore, it constrains military movement to hardened roads. That makes people more of a target. It doesn't mean the war will stop, but it does think in the next 8 to 10 weeks, I think we're going to see a lot more from both sides maneuvering, trying to get themselves an advantage, ready for the inevitable sort of operational pause as the winter arrives.
Let me ask you about that inevitable. I mean, 6 months into this conflict, here's what hasn't changed. President Putin in Russia still sees the Ukraine issue as an existential threat. On the flip side, I mean, besides Ukraine, the U.S. and NATO aren't going anywhere either. I mean, do you think we have a clearer picture of what the end game is?
No, and I think a lot of commentary. The danger is we tend to ignore the fact that this is Putin's war. Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine. And until Putin believes that he's achieved his objectives, it's very difficult to see how he will step down. And I think if you look at it from a commentary perspective, I think he wanted one of his objectives was to take Ukraine. That looks highly unlikely he's going to be able to do that anytime soon. One of his strategic objectives was to stop the expansion of NATO, which he proclaimed. Well, clearly, as a direct result of his invasion, NATO will expand. So he's reaping what he sows there. And also, he was trying to establish Russian greatness again. But again, it's very difficult to see how economically, in the medium term, Russia will undoubtedly suffer big consequences for this, and its diplomatic standing has plummeted. So it's quite difficult to know it feels like Putin's in a bit of a corner from a strategic perspective. And how does he end up proclaiming victory without just continuing to embark on a grinding war of which tens of thousands of his soldiers are dying? And inevitably, gradually, the message is getting through to the Russian public. When the attacks on Crimea happened, there were literally thousands of tourists who were fleeing the Crimea, fleeing to the east back to Russia, who will take with them very vivid images of what Putin's special military operation actually entails. I think this has got some way to play out just yet.
Okay. Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, thank you very much for joining us here on the NewsHour. I do appreciate hearing your analysis. Thank you.